Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday afternoon for another author event. These are so much fun for me. I want to thank our friends at the Ann Arbor District Library, as always, for letting us do these events. We are streaming today's book event, and we'll do absolutely a Q&A at the end of our discussion. And as you can see, there's going to be books for sale and a signing by our author Alan Paul, who's joining us. I've never met Alan in person, but spoke to him for the first time, about 3.5 years ago, when he did a really fantastic biography of Stevie Ray Vaughan. Stevie Ray Vaughan, the great blues rock guitarist, have still very fond memories of having seen him one time only at Hill Auditorium. Were you there in about 86 or so, we think? Alan Paul has written numerous books. This is his second book about the Allman Brothers. This new one is called Brothers and Sisters. It's the Allman Brothers Band and the inside story of the album that defined the 70s. Alan's first book on the Allmans came out a few years ago and again was a bestseller and was widely acclaimed. Alan's life and career goes to a lot of different places, including here in Ann Arbor, where he went to school at the University of Michigan, worked and lived in China for quite a while, and wrote a book about his experiences there. Please welcome Alan Paul to the Ann Arbor District Library. Alan!
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Martin. And I should say, too, although we didn't actually know each other, I listened to you all the time. I lived in Ann Arbor also from 1996 to 98, and I listened to your afternoon show on WDET all the time.
Very cool.
So your voice is very familiar to me. I was a daily listener, and I called you a couple of times then, and we had conversations, but I was just the guy calling, so you had no reason to remember that had happened.
I hope I was polite and not having a bad day on the air or something like that. So, that's so cool. I'm honored. Second book on the Allman Brothers Band. Wow, this band obviously is particularly special to you. Why so?
Well, I'll answer why the second book first, and then circle around to why they're special. I had no intention of writing a second book. The first one came out in 2014. It's called One Way Out, and it's it was hailed. The praise for it was the definitive Allman Brothers Band biography, which is great, but also raises the question of why do it again. That book covered the band's whole 45-year career from 1969 until their last show in 2014, the Beacon Theater in New York, which I was at. It was great. The way I came to writing that book is I just started out as a regular journalist writing about the Allman Brothers. I had always liked them from when I was really little. I don't know exactly why. In 8th grade, I grew up in Pittsburgh. We had to choose a great American to write an essay about in social studies class, and people were writing about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, Roberto Clemente, probably Mean Joe Green. I wrote about Duane Allman. I wish I could go interview my 12-year-old me and ask why, and I don't really know, but I was just drawn to them. And then I started writing about them, and I became I developed good relationships. I was working for Guitar World magazine, so first it was with the guitar players, Dickie Betts and Warren Haynes, and then I would always want to get Gregg in there because he was Gregg. And developed a friendship with the management, especially the tour manager, is a guy named Kirk West, who became an important figure in this book, which we'll get back to. And so slowly, it was like 25 years of writing about them. And you'd have to be a little crazy to invest 25 years in writing a book, in my mind. But also, these guys, especially Gregg and Dickie, were pretty uncomfortable around journalists. One of the reviews of this book said that the only two journalists they ever trusted were Cameron Crowe and me. So I didn't say that, but I am repeating it, so I guess I did say it. But I know it was a great compliment. But Cameron did that in 6 months. I did it over 20 years, where I was just around all the time, and it sort of took that. So finally, I got to write the book, and then this one. I learned so much more, and I started having more. This book, despite the title, which I wanted to change about halfway through, it's worked out, so I have no regrets. But I realized about halfway through writing it how much bigger this book was than just being about that album. And I called my editor and I said, I think that we need to change the cover because it's a bit deceptive. So this is less of a totally, this isn't just about the Allman Brothers. This covers a lot more ground. So this album, Brothers and Sisters, was so successful that it put them in the center of the culture. So because of that, well, actually, can we put on the slides? This is a good time to go to a couple slides. These are pretty random, so let's see what I can find here. That's me.
Yeah.
Oh, you need my password?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand. You can just cut my finger off and hold it. Oh, it's right up. Let me just undo.
Oh,
This
yeah,
is
yeah,
easier
please. Yeah, yeah.
because it's a pattern. I don't even know what it is. Yeah, it's a great pattern. I could show
wow.
it to you. So.
Wow, where's this shot?
That's the warehouse in New Orleans, and I'll explain this a little bit, but let me just finish. So when they reached this point, this is actually, the warehouse in New Orleans was, as you can see, a pretty small place, and it's one of the only smaller venues they continued to play until they just couldn't anymore. I think the last one was New Year's '72, which is what that is. No, that wouldn't have been that, because that's Lamar Williams on the bass. Anyhow, they became so central to the culture, which this picture, in a way, doesn't show, because they started playing stadiums. I have a lot of pictures in here of Watkins Glen, which we'll get to, which was the largest gathering of people in the United States, I think, ever. There were about 650,000 people there. That's there. I got these great pictures of the crowd. I focus on pictures of the crowd because I think that was really the story. They also, during this period, had this very close relationship with the Grateful Dead. That's Jerry Garcia at Watkins Glen. They played that with the Grateful Dead in the band. That's the crowd, again, to give you an idea.
Lord.
Again, I just want to repeat that number, 650,000 people over, and I interviewed a lot of them. So I know I'm being a little rambling here, but there were all these different things that happened. So there was Watkins Glen that I had touched on One Way Out, but I learned so much more about it, I wanted to write more about it. There was the relationship with the Grateful Dead, which I had written about a little bit on One Way Out, but I wanted to go so much more into. There was their relationship with Jimmy Carter, who's sitting right there, if you see in the left corner. That's Jimmy Carter in the Capricorn studio.
Who turns 99 tomorrow, by the way. Yes.
Yeah. So, they were very involved with Jimmy Carter. And this picture I love because it sort of shows, that's Dickie Betts there with the mustache. He was recording his solo album, and that's Phil Walden, the guy with the curly hair in between them, who was their manager and record label owner. He had a good relationship with Carter when he was governor of Georgia. And when he decided to run for president, he was all in, and they got very involved in helping him. But one of the reasons I love this picture is Dickie Betts was recording his solo album, Highway Call, and they get word that Governor Carter, who was no longer governor, but everyone still called him that, was going to come visit, and they all expected him to come shake hands and take some pictures. And he spent like 2 hours sitting in the studio. There's other pictures in this series of him with the headphones on. And I think it sort of indicates how close they were and the relationship they developed and why they liked him so much. I mean, they were aligned with his politics, which of course was important, but his interest in them meant a lot. So I guess this is all a long way to say there were all these things that I had touched on One Way Out, but sometimes in like 1 or 2 sentences that I thought were so ripe for exploration. It took me a long time and a couple of friends talking me into it to realize that this was the way to do it, this album in this era. So.
When did you go to school here? And what did you study? Was it journalism, obviously?
Right. No, I went to school here from 1984 to 88. There was no journalism program to speak of, but I worked at the Michigan Daily all the time. So I have two people from the Michigan Daily from my era here. That's Pete Mooney, and that's Rebecca Blumenstein, who also happens to be my wife of 30 years. But we met at the Daily, so it's not an incidental part of the story. So I was in the residential college. I started out as a creative writing major. I was very involved in journalism in high school. I was lucky to go to a high school with a great journalism program. I was the editor of my paper. I won awards and stuff. I mean, I was really into it. And when I came here, I actually decided in my first year that I wouldn't work at the Daily, because I mean, I don't mean to sound arrogant, but like I knew I could do journalism. Not like I didn't have anything to learn. Obviously, I was 18, but I knew how to do it. And I wanted to. I'd never done creative writing before, and I wanted to see what would happen if I tried to refocus my writing. So I was a creative writing major, but coincidentally, at the same time, my first week or so at school, I got a job as a busboy at Rick's American Cafe. Which was this is how you got a job as a busboy at Rick's. I was hanging out with a friend of mine who was a year older than me, so he had been here for a year, a friend from high school at his fraternity. And some kid on a Friday afternoon, and some other kid comes in and goes, "Anyone want to go work a shift as a busboy at Rick's? I can't make it." And I was like, "They'll give you $50 cash. You know, all you have to do is like pick up glasses and bottles for 2 hours." So I was like, "Oh, I'll do that."
Okay.
So they're like, "Okay, go down and tell Coach that you're working for Steve or whatever." I'm like, "All right." So I did it, and then the guy goes, "Oh, you did a good job. You want to work again next week? Friday happy hour, sure." And then come back, and they're like, "Do you want to work tomorrow night?" So sure. So but this did interfere with my creative writing pursuits, I'm going to admit. But Lee Berry over here ran Prison Productions, booked Rick's, and at that time, and I'm sure a lot of you here remember this, they had music, I think, 5 nights a week. And most weekends it was on the Chicago Blues Club circuit. So it was like Lonnie Brooks, Coco Taylor, Sun Seals. They were the regulars. I mean, a lot of people, Albert Collins, I saw there, Buddy Guy, Robert Cray on his way up. And I just loved, I mean, I had been really into music always. Like I mentioned that Dwayne Allman thing, but I never had seen so much live music. And then I could go in there for free. I could drink in there, even though I was 18 or 19. So I was at Rick's a lot.
I bet.
And my father, who I think had no idea how much I was there, did start to, he knew I was there. And he was sort of on me. He was bugging me to go work at the Daily. He's like, "If you have time, why aren't you at the newspaper?" And he wasn't wrong, but that turned out to be like very influential to me, because that's where I really, really got hooked on music. When I did finally start working at the Daily, I was doing other stuff. I did a lot of literature. I interviewed Allen Ginsberg and Tom Wolfe and Joseph Heller. This is the incredible things about being at a place like U of M. That those people, that was all in one academic school year, I think. They all came. And then Buddy Guy was coming to Rick's, and I was bugging the music editor at the Daily to cover him. She was like, "Yeah, none of the music writers know anything about that kind of music. Why don't you do it?" So I interviewed Buddy Guy, and I just, I loved it. So and basically, I've done a lot of other things over the years, but really after that one interview with him, I never looked back. And then I decided my writing was good, but I wasn't that creative with my creative writing, so I changed to a social science major, and all right. No.
Oh,
All right.
you're good. Oh, there you go.
All right, so we'll go back to some of these.
Oh, yeah,
That's another, that's the Allman Brothers Grateful Dead playing together.
Wow.
That is,
Look at that.
Obviously Gregg Allman and Jimmy Carter. That was during the 1976 campaign. Gregg performed at a telethon fundraiser.
Cool.
Yeah, you guys all remember telethons, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That was a telethon fundraiser for Jimmy Carter. And it was really a pleasure. I was talking about this just earlier, that I did a lot of research at the Carter Center in the Carter Library in Atlanta. And they have a ton of material, and I learned a lot about Jimmy Carter, not just his relationship. That's Gregg and Cher.
Oh, yeah.
They were married in 1974. That's also, I barely touched on that in One Way Out, much to my wife's frustration. But it was always, I started interviewing Gregg in 1989, I think. I never had any limits put on me about what I could talk about with Gregg or any of them, except Cher. He really didn't, it was sort of off limits.
Yeah.
It was the only thing ever. And so I sort of stayed away from this relationship in One Way Out. But it was so relevant to this time period, and also Gregg had passed away, so that nobody could tell me not to, or I didn't need new interviews. But it was a really interesting part of the story. They were the it couple of that era, and it was the start of a new sort of era of celebrity culture. They were on one of the first covers of People magazine, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
So that was interesting to explore.
The whole making of Brothers and Sisters, Alan, it just seems, in a way, a miracle that it even happened, because you're talking about not one, but two band members to both die almost within almost exactly a year, right? A year and 3 months, both in motorcycle accidents.
Right.
Like, how does a band continue to exist, much less record, one of, if not their greatest, one of their absolute greatest albums?
Well, that was such an interesting question. I wrote a whole book about it.
Yeah.
No, that is sort of the essential question
really
that this began with. Like, because how did they get from those tragedies to that point that I was talking about, where they were at the center of culture, and where Gregg is the it couple, and they're electing a president, and they're playing the largest festival ever, all et cetera, all of that. And it is fascinating, and that's basically what the era this book covers is 1971, when Duane Allman died, until 1976, when they broke up for the first time.
The first time. Mm-hmm.
And it is fascinating. When Duane died, and Duane was absolutely the leader of the band. He was his vision. He was the guy who gave them a kick in the butt and made everything happen. And they were at a complete loss as to what to do. But I think the essential thing to realize why they continued is it was the only thing they knew how to do, and Gregg said that to me and to other people in interviews, was basically it was the only way we could survive. I mean, if they had all gone home or broken up or something, they would have all fallen apart. So they just rallied it together, and Gregg wrote the song "Ain't Wasting Time No More." They were halfway through "Eat a Peach," so this last few songs on "Eat a Peach" are actually the first songs of the post-Duane era. And then they toured for a year with just the 5-piece band, which is the same band minus Duane. And then Gregg starts recording a solo album. That brings in Chuck Leavell, a brilliant piano player who was only 19 or 20 at the time. And they start realizing that things are so cool with him that, long story short, he segues into being a member of the Allman Brothers band. So that was part two of how they do it. They add another incredible instrumental voice who is not a guitar player, so it's not replacing Duane per se. And then as they're just kind of getting their feet on the ground and moving along, as you mentioned, Barry Oakley, the bass player, dies. They were 2 songs into recording Brothers and Sisters. He dies in a motorcycle crash. But this time, having been through that experience with Duane, they didn't even hesitate. They just immediately continued, and they started auditioning bass players. And then the answer ends up being Lamar Williams, who was unknown guy, but he was a childhood friend and had been in a lot of bands with J-Mo, one of the founding drummers. So they basically become a new band that's still the same at the essence. And Gregg is getting more and more into, drug issues. And so Dickie Betts here, again pictured, that's the one I was talking about with Jimmy Carter with that. Dickie sort of steps up and takes the front man role, more or less.
Dickie Betts does. Interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, it's still called the Allman Brothers Band. That's the central conflict and dilemma of Dickie Betts' life, is that he's a key figure in a band named after other people. And that's something he's had to contend with, and that's caused issues.
Yeah. There are 2, I mean, I was listening to the album again, taking a little walk before I came here, and it's the original album is it's a brisk listening experience. Is it even 40 minutes or so? It's not a real long album, which is, it's one of those albums, and it's rare these days, where you want more. It's like, oh my God, it's done already. I've got to play it over. And 2 of the songs are such standards. I mean, even people who have no idea who the Allman Brothers band is, if you try to sing the licks from Jessica and Ramblin' Man, it's like, oh, I know those songs.
Right.
I mean,
and those 2 songs are really different from one another. Jessica's an instrumental, of course, and Ramblin' Man is basically a country song, or
Yeah.
I guess you could call it a country rock song.
Yeah.
But they're both Dickie Betts, and so that also is written by Dickie Betts. That
Both
also-
written by him?
Yeah, that also demonstrates sort of the range he had within himself. And then both of those songs are completely lit on fire by Chuck Leavell, the piano player we talked about. And I'm just gonna. This is gets at the tangential again, but this is a really interesting photo I came across.
Yeah.
That's Owsley Stanley on the motorcycle. That's at Watkins Glen. Owsley was the Grateful Dead's sound guru, and he was also not the creator of LSD, but that came from a lab in Switzerland. But he was the I don't know what the word. He was the chemist who made he made the LSD, and he was the Grateful Dead's patron. I mean, they've only existed through all these lean years because of him. And there are very few pictures of him because of his drug stuff. He didn't take pictures. This was an incredible thing I came across. All these Watkins Glen photos, somebody popped up out of nowhere and offered them to me. He was a kid who was a student at Middlebury College in Vermont. He was the photo editor of the college newspaper there. So he was more than just a guy with a camera. He was, a serious amateur photographer. But when I saw that one, it just kind of flipped me out. There's very, very few pictures
That's
of
a cool shot.
We
Was
don't know who the woman
the
is.
band was playing a lot when they were not in the studio? Were they working like a lot of these songs out live before they would record them in the studio, Alan?
No, most of these songs were worked out in the studio, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And the album, it took about a full year before it came out,
It took about a year, which was, it's not really that long of a time, but
Right.
at that time, it was really a long time.
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
like if you watch the Beatles documentary, Get Back, for instance, they were falling apart. They were coming apart at the seams and everything. And they did their last 3 albums in a year. I mean, Creedence Clearwater Revival released 3 incredible albums in 1966. I think.
Dylan released 3
Yeah,
of his
so, I
greatest
mean,
albums in a year and a half. Barely.
Things moved pretty fast. So taking a year, there was actually 2 years because there was a year pause in between recording, and then almost a year while they were recording. So it had been 2 years since Eat a Peach came out, almost a year and a half, I think. But so. Again, that's not a long time, but by the standards of the time it was, and I guess because there were questions around the Allman Brothers if they would continue, so people were getting really, antsy. But meanwhile, Gregg recorded an incredible, great solo album, Laid Back at that time. They integrated 2 new band members. They dealt with the death. They played Watkins Glen. They did a lot, so it's not like they were lazy. And as I explore in the book, I mean, I don't shy away from the ugly sides. I mean, they were pretty deep into a lot of substance abuse, and how exactly all of that happened at the same time while they were dealing with all of that, including the substance abuse.
Oh, I mean,
bit
a lot of the
amazing.
passages in your book, it's like they make the Rolling Stones sound kind of temperate and conservative with their personal. I mean, it's really extraordinary. Like, it seemed like an OD a day or something. I'm not mean to be facetious, but it's like there's really out of control behavior in this band. I mean, even for a rock band, it's like, oh my God, yeah, tough stuff. Was all the album recorded in one studio? Who produced the album?
Yeah. Let's see if I can get back to the picture of Jimmy Carter. It was all produced in Capricorn Studios in Macon.
The record label studios.
Yeah, so the guy sitting at the board there next to Phil Walden is Johnny Sandlin, and he produced the record. He produced everything they were doing at that time. He was an old friend. He had been the drummer in the Allman Joys, which became the Hourglass, which was Dwayne and Gregg Allman's pre-Allman Brothers band. I think we should pause for a second to appreciate that Allman Joy. Funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
So the album finally comes out in August of '73, is that right?
Yes, August of 1973, so we just had the 50th anniversary.
And how did it do? It's just extraordinary.
It did extraordinarily
Huge hit.
well, yeah. It took off immediately. I think it sold went platinum, which is 1 million copies in a couple of weeks.
1 million copies sold.
Yeah, and the Ramblin' Man became #2 song. It was the only top 10 hit they ever had.
Wow.
It was kept from being #1 by Cher's Half Breed.
Oh, was it that? Oh, seriously?
Cher at that
Seriously?
point had no connection to them. That only became a funny.
Isn't that funny?
point later, but yeah, yeah.
Oh, gosh. How did their friendship with the Grateful Dead start and develop? They were really tight, I see.
Yeah, so I wrote, this is another thing, like there were a lot of these topics as I started the book. I knew I would explore, but I got a little deeper into all of them, like Watkins Glen, I thought would be a chapter, it became 2 chapters. And same with the relationship with the Grateful Dead, became 2 chapters. The Dead existed about 4 years before the Allman Brothers. So they were already established and had put out several albums by the time they formed. And a couple of the guys, especially Barry Oakley, the bass player, and Duane Allman were big Grateful Dead fans. So they started crossing paths pretty early. Then they played some shows together in 1970 at the Fillmore East. February 1970, I tell the story in there. They had some incredible jam sessions, like 2 a.m. sort of things. Jerry Garcia and Duane Allman were very close. Interestingly, in those early jams, Dickie Betts never sat in. He and Jerry Garcia had a real kinship in terms of their approach, because both of them came from acoustic music, bluegrass, which Dickie calls string music, which it's the same thing. It's all derived from sort of Appalachian folk music and Scottish, Irish reels and stuff. And Dickie's family was really into that. He played ukulele and mandolin and violin before he played guitar. And all of those phrasings come out in that's one of the things that made Dickie's playing so unique. He would play patterns that are more familiar to major key, like up bluegrass acoustic music in minor key settings. And Garcia did the same thing. He also had a bluegrass background in banjo and guitar. So they had this real kinship. And in this era, after Duane had died, they started playing shows together. And Dickie and Jerry just loved each other and loved playing together. And you can hear it if you listen to the recordings of them playing together. It's even sometimes hard to tell which is which. You have to really pay attention. But you can tell they're just really happy. So the last time they played together was New Year's Eve in 1973 at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. And Garcia sits in and he ends up playing the whole, I think he plays about 2 hours. And they played until 4 in the morning, way past they were contractually obligated to. They were just having too much fun playing.
Man.
So, and that turned out to be the last time they ever played together.
Let's get into this Watkins Glen gig, because, boy, this one is really overshadowed, isn't it, by, the Woodstock and Monterey Pop and the notorious Altamont Festival. And this is a pretty reasonably reliable figure. 600,000 people attended. How many days was this event?
Right.
And where is Watkins Glen again, for those who may not be familiar?
Yeah, we were just in Watkins Glen this summer, coincidentally. It's in the Finger Lakes region of New York, so
upstate.
It's close to Ithaca. It's in western New York. I mean, it's headed towards
Buffalo?
Yeah, it's in that direction, but it's really the middle of nowhere.
Okay.
So heading towards Niagara Falls and Buffalo. There is a racetrack. They had an annual Grand Prix race at Watkins Glen that took about 100,000 people. And so they chose that as a place because that was about the crowd they expected, 100 to 150,000. That was a place that was proven to be able to sustain the crowd of that size. So that's how they ended up there. Plus, a lot of other places didn't want them. They were originally going to Springfield, Massachusetts, and the mayor or whatever, the city council or whatever, rejected that. After Woodstock and Altamont, a lot of municipalities became a little leery of having these kind of gatherings. And it is interesting, as you, I think, alluded to in your question, that it's not as well known as all those other festivals, even though it was quite a bit bigger. I mean, Woodstock was about 50% smaller. It was 400,000 people. At some point, maybe it doesn't matter, I guess, it's a lot of people. This didn't have the same cultural impact. Woodstock was like Monterey was where Jimi Hendrix debuted for the first time in America, Jimi Hendrix Experience. I mean, just so much happened. So that's when, and then Woodstock is where like the mainstream of America started to realize this huge explosion of youth culture and how they could exploit it and market it, and that it wasn't some crazy fringe thing. And Watkins Glen was already an established. It just didn't have the same huge reach somehow, but it did to the people who were there. If I live in New Jersey. If I was at any kind of event like this and I say, how many people were at Watkins Glen? A bunch of people in the room raise their hand. Those are the people who come to my events. But a lot of people were there, and although it was 50 years ago, they were pretty young, and most of them are, thank God, still with us. And it was just an indelible experience for the people who went, and they have the wildest stories. I mean, and I also met some people who were like trying to sneak out when they were 14 with their older sister, and the mom figured out what was going on. And, kids who had a ticket and but couldn't go, and then people from Canada, because the crowds got so bad that it's quite close to the Canadian border. They closed the crossing, so at some point, the New York State called the federal government and said, you got to, we got to start. We have too many people here, so they closed the border crossings in that part of the country. So there were a bunch of people from Canada who were had tickets and then didn't make it. It was just, and one of the people I interviewed described it to me like this: that he was someone who was there when he was 17, and he said, we were all old enough to be like fully cognizant of Woodstock, which was 4 years earlier,
Right.
but too young to go. Kids who were 10, 11 when Woodstock happened, 12, and their cousins went, or their older brothers and sisters, or their neighbors, and they were all like, if something like this happens again, I'm going. And it happened, and they went. And, they sold 150,000 tickets. And then at some point, you asked how long it was. It was supposed to be a one-day festival only. But there had been some rain and stuff, and so they hadn't completed the sound check. The day before the day that it was supposed to happen, it was a Saturday, so it was on a Friday. There were already over 150,000 people there, and the highways are jammed with people coming, and they hadn't really checked the sound system, which was created just for it. So what are they going to do? So Bill Graham, who was involved, although he wasn't actually the promoter of it, he did the staging. He said, just go out and play, and he said, I knew that one way to keep everyone calm is to let them see that the bands are here, that the music is going to be good, that the sound system works, everything's going to be cool, just chill out, people, And so he just figured, the quote he said, I have in the book, is, I knew if I got them out there, they weren't going to sound check by saying, give me an A, give me a B. So the Grateful Dead go out to sound check, and what do? In typical Grateful Dead fashion? They play 4 hours. So they played a show.
Wow.
And by the way, a fantastic show. I don't know why it's never been released, but it's easily found on that. It's on YouTube and Internet Archive. Their actual show at the next day was sort of mediocre, but Garcia talked about that a lot. Their performance at Woodstock was so bad they refused to allow it in the movie or soundtrack, so most people don't even know the Grateful Dead were there. And I guess they played the Monterey Pop Festival. They didn't play well. They just somehow, it's weird, but they had a tendency to not play their best shows at the biggest shows. But this soundcheck thing was great. So then the Allman Brothers, of course, are like, wow, they played 4 hours. So they went out and played 2 or 3 hours. And the band was also, they played in between them.
Wow.
But the band gets a little bit forgotten sometimes in this, but it was really a partnership with the Allman Brothers and the Grateful Dead, and they wanted a third band, so they asked the band, who they obviously all loved.
Oh man, what a lineup! Oh, what a lineup! Tell me about the band's tour mystic. Let's get into this. This guy Kirk West and these interviews that were really crucial for your book. Who is this guy, or was this guy?
Yeah. Kirk is still very much with us.
Good,
I was
good.
actually with him last weekend in Macon, Georgia. Kirk is he's one of my best friends for the last 30 years. So we'll run that through whatever I say. But he was a fanatical fan. I mean, fan is short for fanatic. Remember, but. Who, while the band was broken up in the 80s, he's a photographer. He's a great photographer, actually, from Chicago. He's actually from Iowa originally. He was just inducted into the Iowa Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Oh, I didn't know there was one.
It's
Okay.
nobody knew there was one, but there is one, and he is in it. And he was wearing an Iowa Rock and Roll Hall of Fame hat last weekend when I was with him. But he's from Chicago. He got to know these guys through photographing them initially. During the period that they were broken up in the 80s, 1986, 87, Lee was probably promoting solo Gregg Allman shows at the Second Chance, maybe, right? And I mean, that's what they were doing. You know, they had gone and, you know, from playing stadiums to playing, you know, clubs individually as solo acts. Kirk was going to write a book, and so he traveled around. He did tons of interviews with everyone. He already had really close relationships with them, and so the interviews were really intimate. They were different than like just a regular journalist asking questions. And he spent a lot of time with them. Like when he did the interviews with Gregg, he was on the road with them. Hours and hours of interviews with everyone, all the band members who were still alive. Bill Graham, I mentioned the interview with Bill Graham, that's from an interview with Kirk. Other tour members, crew members, you know, managers, Phil Walden, everyone, wives, blah, blah, blah. And I used a tiny bit of them on One Way Out because Red Dog was a famous roadie for the band who was a very crucial member. And I knew Red Dog quite well. I talked to him a lot at shows and stuff, but I never actually interviewed him. And by the time I started writing One Way Out, he had passed away. One Way Out was a oral history format. All the quotes were from my interviews. So I asked Kirk if I could have some of his Red Dog interviews because I wanted Red Dog to have a presence in the book, and I had never interviewed him. So I did that. So I was well aware of these interviews, but I never thought to ask Kirk. And right after I had signed the contract and was started working on the book, Kirk said to me, would you like my tapes? And, you know, I should have finished. So he got, when they reformed in 1989, he had compiled and produced the Dreams box set, which was crucial to them getting back together, actually. So he indirectly played a role in them reuniting. And then they hired him initially as the tour photographer, and then they fired the tour manager, made him the tour manager. Yeah, Dickie Betts went to him, to Kirk, and said, I don't like talking to that guy, and I like talking to you. So when he needs to tell me something, he can tell you, and then you can tell me, and then I'll tell you, and you can tell him. And then he did that for a little while, and then they just fired the other guy and made Kirk the tour manager. And he said, well, I'm not a tour manager, I'm a photographer. And they said, don't worry about it. We like talking to you, so it'll be fine. And so he became their tour manager, but he did so many different things that he became, they called him the tour mystic.
Tour mystic.
Because, yeah, he just played a huge role in so many things. He did the normal tour manager things, which was, you know, getting people on and off the buses and dealing with the security at the venue and the production at the venue and the union handlers and all that kind of stuff. But he also was sort of the liaison to the community. He did all their archival releases. He started the Allman Brothers Band Museum at the Big House in Macon, Georgia. Rebecca and I went down there and visited him. The first time I went to Macon, I think it was 1993, right after he had bought the house, which was their formal communal house. And he had one of Gregg Allman's Hammond B3 organs there. So we sat down to play it, but the only thing we could play was chopsticks. So Rebecca and I played chopsticks on Gregg Allman's organ. I do play guitar. I don't play keyboards. But yeah, so Kirk was and he was the way that I sort of transitioned in from being a regular journalist writing about the band to being an insider, because we developed a relationship and then a friendship. And he started hiring me to work with him on archival releases. So I would, you know, got to go to the studio with him and pull out the tape vaults and stuff. It was pretty incredible.
Oh, cool.
And write some liner notes and stuff. So he's been a crucial. I mean, none of my whole journey with the Allman Brothers would have really happened without him. And then, so there was something poetic to me about having his tapes play such a huge role. And he was happy because it was, you know, a very significant part of his life at the time, that then he got hired by the band, so he couldn't write the book, and he just sort of shoved this suitcase full of tapes, you know, into a corner. It was literally in a closet in his house, two-sided thing. So when he asked if I wanted them, I went down to Macon in September 2021. It was only 2 years ago, which is a little crazy to me, with my son Jacob, who's a photographer, and this wasn't the intent of why he was with me or anything, but he took pictures of Kirk handing the cassettes to me, almost as like Appomattox or something, like signing.
Right.
And they were cool. So I used a couple of those in the book, which was kind of neat. But yeah, I mean, I would have written the book anyhow. I already had signed the contract and was doing it, but at this point, it's hard for me to imagine what it would have been because, like I mentioned that you couldn't really talk to Gregg about Cher. This is just one example. Gregg talked to Kirk extensively for hours about Cher and his relationship. And so it was really the only time that I think that there's Gregg's firsthand take. He wrote about it in his own memoir, but frankly, with a lot less honesty. He was censoring himself in the, I think, a normal way that people do when they're writing a memoir. I'm not really criticizing him about that, but when he was talking to Kirk, he was much less guarded, and he was more honest. So, and that's just one example. There are so many things where they were talking about each other and their own, sometimes their admiration for each other, that while they were together, they would have jealousies and stuff, and they weren't be so forthcoming. It was an interesting period. They were broken up. It was only 10 to 12 years after all the events in the book, so it's still relatively fresh. So it wasn't 40 years later. And they were a bit wistful because they knew what they had lost. They were playing little clubs now, and putting together bands. They were romantic about it, but also realistic. So the interviews are fascinating. It was a ton of work to digitize them, listen to them, transcribe them, figure out what to use from them. But it was also fascinating work, and it really enriching, and it gave the book so much more depth than it would have had.
We'll return to the subject of Cher, but we're going to talk about the band's relationship with President Jimmy Carter. How did that start out? Did Jimmy Carter reach out to the band as a fan, or
a little bit of both. I mentioned before that Phil Walden, their manager, had a relationship with Carter when he was governor.
Right.
He started lobbying Carter because he wanted the music industry to be taken a little more seriously. Georgia was already starting to court the film industry. I mean, Georgia has been like a center of filmmaking for decades. But the music industry was thriving there, and it was sort of being ignored. So Phil started working him on that, and they really liked him. The governor before Jimmy Carter was Lester Maddox, who was, one of these infamous racists. He owned a restaurant. And when they came and tried to integrate it, he beat people with an axe handle, which was like got picked up by the AP or whatever, was out on the wires. And so these guys were, including Phil Walden, who started his career as Otis Redding's manager, and the members of the band were much more progressive racially, and they hated being represented nationally by someone like that. And so they were all into Carter when he was the governor. The band wasn't involved with him, but Phil Walden was. He did some fundraising and stuff. So when Carter decided he was going to run for president, he told Phil, and Phil said, "No problem, I'll take care of this." And he became on his campaign committee. He was really involved. Now again, you saw those pictures of him with Dickie Betts. That was right when he was maybe starting to run for president or just before. He did have relationships with them. But I tell the story, again, from Kirk's interviews in here. He had a party. Bob Dylan didn't tour for 8 years, which is wild, 1966 to 74. His 74 tour was a huge deal. So Carter buys 16 tickets from the promoter. He and his sons were Dylan fanatics. He insisted on paying. This is another Jimmy Carter thing, how honest he was. So the promoter wanted to, would have certainly given the governor free seats.
Sure.
And then he invited the band and Bob Dylan to a post-show late-night party at the governor's mansion. Wow. And Bill Graham, who was promoting the tour, called Phil Walden. And, Bill is a classic character, really fast-talking New York guy, and he was basically like, "Phil, who the hell is this governor? We got a crazy invite. Is this legit? What the hell is this?" And he said, "Oh yeah, Jimmy Carter, man, he's my man. That's real. You should do it. You should do it. Tell Bob to do it." And so they did it. And so they also invited all the Capricorn Records and Allman Brothers people. The Capricorn executives, including Phil, were there. None of the Allman Brothers showed up. Gregg was recording or rehearsing for his solo tour, I think, actually, in Macon. It's about 80 miles away from Atlanta. And around 11 or 12 o'clock, he's like, oh, man, we ought to go up to the governor's mansion. So they get in a limo. He drives up there, and he gets there, and the lights are off. It's a little vague as to what time it was. But my estimation, it had to be 2 or 3 in the morning because remember the party was after the show,
After
so it
the show.
didn't begin until 11 or 12 o'clock.
Right, yeah,
And
yeah.
Gregg got there as like the last guests were leaving, and so Gregg said that he said, well, oh well, I want it to be known I was here, so he told his limo to pull up to the security guard, and he said, let it be known to the governor that Gregg Allman arrived. and he said, okay. And they got back in the car to leave, and they were turning around, and the security guard came running out and waved at them and said, the governor is up and he wants to see you. So they drove up. It was Gregg, and I believe his wife, then wife Janice, was with him. It's really hard to pin that down. They drove up, and Carter was standing on the porch in a pair of jeans and a T-shirt, and Gregg was sort of like, "Who is that guy?" And it's the governor, and and he invites. They talk on the porch, and Jimmy Carter said to him, I got some Elmore James I got a new Elmore James record. Why don't we go in and listen to it? So they walk in, and as they're walking in to the governor's mansion, Jimmy Carter starts quoting Gregg's lyrics to him, which blew Gregg away. And I'm sure, Jimmy Carter was a savvier politician than, people think that he was just like, this yokel guy who had good charm or whatever. He was pretty savvy. He knew how to get Gregg going. So they go in, they get out a bottle of J&B Scotch, which is the Scotch that all these guys drank. Gregg claimed they drank the whole bottle. Jimmy Carter says, I never had more than one drink, if I had, which probably is more like it. But in any case, they did sit and drink Scotch and listen to Elmore James. And then Jimmy Carter said, I'm looking to run for president. I could use your help. And Gregg said that he laughed and he thought, this guy, like, drinking Scotch and listening to Elmore James with me is going to be president. That's like the stupidest thing I ever heard. But he really liked him, so he said, sure. And he said in one of these interviews with Kirk, it was a friendship thing, if he had asked me to support him for used car lots, I would have lent him some money. I just liked him. And
You like the guy.
Just like the guy. And he did like his politics. It's not like he was at odds with him. And so they got involved. And Phil Walden wasn't just them. He set up concerts all over. This was the first election with new campaign finance laws coming out of Watergate, and so there was limits to how much money people could make, and there were federal matching funds for the first time. So being able to have a concert and make like $50,000 a night was huge. You could then match it and get $100,000. And in fact, even if the expenses of the concert meant that you only got $5,000 profit because you have to pay the venue and you still could get the $50,000 matching fund on the ticket sales, which were a donation. So it was significant for them. And then this is the one. This was the biggest one they did at the Providence Civic Center. And this copy of it came from the Carter Center, Carter Library, and it's signed by Jimmy Carter.
Wow.
You see that? So.
That is so cool.
Yeah, and they retained a friendship until the very end. Gregg got an honorary doctorate from Mercer University in Macon not too long before he passed away, and Jimmy Carter presented it to him. And when Gregg died in 2017, Carter was at the funeral. So, and it's amazing that he's with us. They announced in February that he was in hospice care, and that's why I rushed out and I did an excerpt from the book about Carter in the Wall Street Journal, because the anticipation at that point was he's about to pass away. So, he's still here. I sent him a copy of the book. I was told by his assistant that he has it, and she read some of it to him. He liked it, which is, of course, really meaningful.
Incredible.
And it's an interesting, fascinating part of the story.
I want to make time for questions from the folks who are here and time for the book signing, but two more things to ask you quickly here, Alan. What led to the initial demise of the Allman Brothers band? And yeah, talk a little bit more about this relationship that Gregg had with Cher. How did they first meet?
Yeah, well, they're not unrelated, but not not in the sense. Sometimes people, call Cher the Yoko Ono of the Beatles, of the Allman Brothers. I don't even know if it's fair to call Yoko Ono the Yoko Ono of the Beatles. I mean, I think it's really simplistic to say she led to the Beatles breakup.
Yeah.
I don't think that's fair. I think it's definitely not fair with Cher. The only way that it had an impact is that Gregg moved in with Cher in Beverly Hills, so he was not around that much. He was coming back and forth between Macon and Beverly Hills. I think another part of the weird dynamic was he tried so hard to keep himself relatively clean when he was in Beverly Hills with Cher that when he came back to Macon with his old running buddies, he went really off the deep end. So it was really hard to ever just get him in the studio. And so that was a factor, but I think it was more their demise was just, they had had these two deaths. I believe, to talk in, I guess, psychological parlance, they had just, they pushed all the emotions down. Then they had this incredible success, this incredible ride. And I think they were exhausted. I think they were emotionally frayed. Yeah. And it's kind of wild to realize how young they all still were, even at the end of that point. They were barely 30, or they weren't 30. These guys were 28, 29. But they were just fried. They were just crispy fried. And I think in a slightly more calm era, they may have just been able to take a hiatus for a year or something and come back. But they also cracked under the weight of, there was a federal RICO case against a group called the Dixie Mafia, which is this sort of loose criminal affiliation. They're not really organized crime like we think of as the mafia, but they controlled, the same kind of stuff, prostitution, drugs, racketeering, all that, in various regions. And Gregg got caught up in this thing because the guy that he was getting drugs from was getting his drugs from a source that was related to the Dixie Mafia. And that guy was their crew member. So they squeezed Gregg to testify against his road manager. So they were squeezing him to testify against the big guys. So Gregg was a small fish caught up in this, and he testified in a federal trial, and it caused quite a stir. And the band sort of all turned on him. The rock and roll world turned on him. Rolling Stone said that he might never perform again. And the one person who didn't turn on him was Jimmy Carter, who had the most reason to, in a way. I mean, this was the summer before, this was August of 1976, so it's a couple of months before the election. If you think of any other politician that we ever know, probably would have put out a statement saying, I'm disappointed in Gregg, I respect all the help, but I must now, he's in no affiliation with my campaign. He didn't do that at all. He stuck with him, so I think that's an interesting coda to that part of the story.
Very interesting. I lied. One final question for you before we take questions from the audience. Tell your alter ego musical career. You got to mention that. You were saying before we got started, you've been quite busy between promoting the book and doing gigs, right?
Yeah. So I play guitar, and I have a Allman Brothers tribute band called Friends of the Brothers, which I formed with friends actually who played with Dickie Betts and J-Mo and Gregg Allman. And it's been a great way to promote the book. It's a little more fun than just going to bookstores. We go and do shows and and do it. So it's fun. It's wearing me out a little bit, to be honest. So I'm gonna take I have a bunch of stuff this coming month, October. Then I'm gonna slow it down for a little bit.
All right, some questions before we get into our chance for you to sign copies of the Alan's book. Yeah, we'll bring the mic to you if you got a question, please.
Oh, hey, Alan. I think it sounds, when I listen to interviews, it sounds like it's more challenging to interview musicians than, say, other folks like actors or novelists. Is that your sense, or musicians harder to get the talking, or is it just, I mean, Terry Gross is great, but it feels like it's hard to get musicians to be
I think it's like anything. It just depends on the person. I think generally musicians have a lot more to say than actors. I mean, actors are often just pretty faces who are reading other people's words. I mean, a lot of times they transcend that, of course, but I mean, they didn't write the words. Seriously, like, you know, Gregg. I mean, it's interesting and to have the opportunity to have long-term relationships with some of these guys, especially them. But there's of course other people. I've been doing this for a long time. Gregg, he could be a great interview, and that's where like being around, like when I was through my relationship with Kirk, I'd be backstage before shows and stuff, and you know, I never really knew if Gregg knew who I was, but I didn't feel that bad because the guy who was their sound guy through this whole period told me that Gregg never remembered his name the whole time.
The sound guy.
So, but Gregg definitely, he knew who I was. I don't know if he knew my name or not at various points, but he recognized me as someone who was around all the time. And I did some really great interviews with Gregg. I did also do some where he would, you know, he toured constantly. He had his solo band as well as the Allman Brothers. So he did a lot of like interviews with, you know, the Ann Arbor News, every newspaper and little radio station in the country to promote a concert. And so he could be in the mode where he would just give you canned answers, for sure. But I was usually able to break through that because of all the years of talking to him, or I knew little things to sprinkle in. And occasionally, a few of the interviews I did with him were really fantastic. One especially in a hotel room in Chicago after one of his solo shows. It was at like, you know, we started the interview at 1 or 2 in the morning, and we're talking until, I don't know, 3 or 4. And he was really, really open. At that time, it was from Guitar World Acoustic Magazine, and I had wanted him to demonstrate some stuff. I brought an acoustic guitar with me, my acoustic guitar, actually my friend's acoustic guitar. But anyhow, he played it, he showed me some stuff, and then he just started playing and singing. He did Come and Go Blues. I have a recording of it, but I can't do anything with it. But that interview, and I think it was because of the setting and maybe having the guitar with me, loosened him up a lot. That was really memorable, and he talked a lot about his love of folk music, Jackson Browne, Neil Young, Tim Buckley, who are people that people don't really associate Gregg with. He eventually talked about that a little more, but at that time, which was I think around 96 or 97, he hadn't really talked about that stuff, and so it was really fascinating. And then if you go back and you listen to like Melissa or even Midnight Rider, and you think of it in terms of him being influenced by Jackson Browne and Neil Young, it makes a lot of sense. You know, those songs came out of somewhere, and they're not blues songs.
Thanks.
Interesting.
Hey, Alan, thanks for being here and for sharing. I think I met you your freshman year in East Quad, and our paths went a different way. But I also remember, and this is a question about your experience with the Michigan Daily, and you talked about Rick's, and I remember seeing a Matt Guitar Murphy show there as well.
Oh, I saw
and
he was there a lot, yeah.
Yeah, and you are a sports guy though. Right, I remember you wrote for Slam magazine or Hoops magazine or something like that. And didn't you have a column in the Daily called Fat Al?
All true. It's
All true, yeah.
Well,
so how
let's
did
hear more
how did
about
you
this,
turn
Alan.
from
Fat Al's
sports to music, or what? How did that work?
Well, I mean, okay, so as a career, being in doing sports and music is pretty unusual. But as an interest group, I don't think it is. I mean, me and all my friends were always into sports and into music. I mean, it never seemed weird to me. I just had the opportunity to do it. When I went to the Daily, when I started working at the Daily, I think I went to the sports department, actually. I don't know, I don't think I actually ever wrote anything there. I did later do sports. I mean, I covered high school baseball games for the St. Petersburg Times, but it was more of a cultural fit. Like the sports guys, they weren't really my people. And then the news guys were a little too serious. So I just kind of kept drifting around. And then I just felt more socially comfortable with the arts people. And so I just stuck there and started writing. I mean, I felt like in terms of my writing or journalism, I could have done anything. any of those. I think most people who are journalists, the journalism comes first and the subject matter is second in a way. I mean, I didn't really approach, I was a senior writer for Slam for, I don't know, a long time, 10 years maybe, or 8 years, I don't know. But I didn't approach interviewing those guys any differently than I approached interviewing Gregg Allman in a way. I mean, you prepare, you try to make a connection, you talk. You know, it's still the same. I mean, you're interviewing people and you're trying to tell their story, and you know, you do as much research as you can so you know things, hopefully get them off guard. And because that's another similarity with athletes. Like I was mentioning, Gregg doing all those. I mean, it's really hard to get athletes to not talk cliches. I mean, they're taught to speak cliches because it keeps them out of trouble. And so that was the challenge there, writing about that. And that was easier. Sometimes I did a lot of retired guys for Slam. That was easier. You know, the current players, you know, if you can get them back talking about high school or their childhood or stuff, sometimes it's easier than talking. And then you come back to the team, things like that. But yeah, it's all the same in a way. You just pick a topic and you know, write about it. And I love basketball. I felt like I know a lot about basketball, so I was comfortable, you know, being something like an expert.
Got one,
So,
Lee?
Alan, if you can, tell us how many Allman Brothers shows you have seen, and is there one that stands out as your favorite?
Good question.
Okay, good question. I don't know how many I saw. I never was a counter, and I used to be proud of that. Now it kind of annoys me, to be really honest. I wish I had an answer. I did try to come up with it around the time of One Way Out, which is they ceased to exist after that. So, and it, you know, it's in the 100 range. I mean, I went their last year in 2014. They played I think 15 shows, and I went to 14 of them. Now remember, I lived in and around New York City, and starting in 1990. Well, they played the Beacon for the first time in 1989. Starting in 1991, it became an annual, more or less thing, where they would play multiple shows at the Beacon Theater, sometimes up to 20, 25, I think. They peaked at 20, something like that. So I had a lot of opportunities just at the Beacon. And I do know two people who went to every show at the Beacon, which ended up being, I think, 238. I did not go to remotely all of the shows, but I went to a lot. So on a normal run, I would, you know, I'd go to 4, 5, 6, and then these last couple of years, 2013, I was writing the book. 2014 book was out. I went to all of them. So I don't know. That's like 30 some right there. In terms of most memorable, there's a few. The first time I saw them was in Pittsburgh in 1979 or 80. I was pretty young. And it turned out, it was 1980. That was actually like their worst era. But I didn't know that. You know, I thought was so excited to see Gregg and Dickie, and I was a kid. I could just kind of walk up in front of the stage. I did the same thing. I saw the Grateful Dead there. I just walked up and stood in front of Garcia. So that was amazing. Definitely not the best show, but it was the first time. And then when they reformed in '89, I saw them for the first time in 1990. We were living in Florida. I saw them in Tampa. And that really stands out because I didn't realize how good how good they were. That was when they had added Warren Haynes. So I was expecting more of like, I knew it would be fun to see them. I didn't expect them to be as powerful as it was. And then there was a bunch of shows at the Beacon. 2009 on their 40th anniversary, they had all these special guests. And the night with Eric Clapton was incredible. He played 2 nights. I remember I was at the first night, and I couldn't go to the second because I came to Michigan to go to my father-in-law's 70th birthday party. He was right there. He's no longer 70, oddly. But yeah, that Clapton show was incredible. There were a bunch of the guests. Little Milton, I think it was 2005, sitting in with them was incredible. And then the last show was really epic. They somehow pulled off a memorable last waltz type of show with no guests, just them. But yeah, and I'm sure if I sit and think about it, I'll think of 5 or 10 more.
One more question? Yeah, please. Yeah.
Totally esoteric question. So going back to your creative writing roots, have you had a chance to look at Daisy Joan and the Six?
Yeah.
So, you know, the speculation is who's the band that really inspired that? And there's a lot of similarities between the Allmans and the band that focuses on. Just didn't know if you had an opinion about it.
Yeah, I don't. So I read the book and then I watched the show. When I read the book, I liked it. I was a little pissed off because it was both of my last two books were before this one were oral history format, which is what that is, and I had the idea for a while to do like a novel oral make up a band to do an oral history. So I was like, oh no. I mean, I guess it's not the most original idea, but it was something in the back of my head that I would do. So when I realized that she had done that, I was a little like, God damn it. But it's a good book. No, I don't think it's that much about the Allman Brothers. I think it's pretty much Fleetwood Mac. You know, with the sexual tension between the male and female protagonists. But Almost Famous. We didn't touch on that, but Cameron Crowe is a major part of this book.
Yeah.
Almost Famous is the band Stillwater is really based on the Allman Brothers. It's a composite. There's stuff from the Eagles in there as well and other people, but so it's not necessarily like the personalities of each guy aligned with the Allman Brothers. But Cameron Crowe had an experience like that on the road with the Allman Brothers. That was his first Rolling Stone cover story. That was the band that went on the road. And Gregg stole his tapes. So if you remember the movie Almost Famous, they regret doing the interview, and so they when the fact checker called, they deny everything and say he made it up. That was how he fictionalized it, but he really was in that situation where they took his tapes, and he was 16, and so. And he, Cameron was great. He cooperated fully with this. This is the way in which sometimes the second books get easier. He read one way out and really liked it. So it was easier to get him for this. And I love this chapter in the book. I think it's one of the best chapters I've ever written, actually. I felt really, really good about that. And so I explain the relationship to Almost Famous at length. But that band is really based on them. Yeah, there are times in Daisy Jones on the TV show where the guys look like that. And I'll tell you the one line, and I don't remember if this was in the book, but on the TV show, that was the most honest line in that whole thing that related to what I have seen, is when she's like losing it and, getting all strung out, and she like throws a fit in the catering and turning stuff over, and they have to pull her off. And someone goes up to the manager, Timothy Oliphant, the actor I love, and says, don't you see what's going on here? Like, do something. And he's like, yeah, I see what's going on. I'm not going to do anything. I don't do honesty. Honesty gets me fired. And that is the most, I've seen that with management. Kirk got in trouble sometimes because he would try to do things, and the guy who was above him as the manager just always, they're expert at surviving, so.
Ellen, Paul, thanks for being here. Glad you made it here from the East Coast through the storms yesterday. We've got copies available of this brilliant new book about one of the greatest rock albums of all time, and Alan Paul's thoroughly researched book about brothers and sisters, so feel free to grab a copy. Thank you all for being here today, and Alan, thank you for stopping by.
And hi to anyone. I don't know if anyone's watching this on the stream, but if you are, thank you.